I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, a Congressional Subcommittee hearing over the question of whether the United States should or should not move its U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to the capital of Israel, Jerusalem. I'm sure all of you know this has been a hot-button issue for administration after administration, both Democrats and Republicans. During every presidential campaign, candidates seem to woo Jewish Israeli supporters with a promise to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. George Bush promised. Barack Obama promised. Donald Trump promised. And then year after year, the U.S. Embassy remains in Tel Aviv. Now, what's worthy of note is that the United States has its embassy in the capital city of every country in which it is present, except in Israel. Why is Israel an exception to the U.S. diplomatic rule with respect to placing its embassy in a nation's capital city? Also, you may not know, or you may not remember, in 1995, Congress passed the Jerusalem Embassy Act with overwhelming majority support. That 1995 act requires Congress to withhold funds from the State Department if the U.S. Embassy is not moved. But president after president has exercised a national security waiver provision that permits the president to delay the move. The most recent waiver was signed on June 1st of this year by President Trump. And President Trump must decide whether he will renew that waiver on December 1st of this year. And so the House Committee on National Security held hearings to hear arguments for the benefits and what are the dangers in moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Many prominent Jewish and non-Jewish leaders testified before the House Committee on this issue, including former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton, longtime Israeli diplomat and the current president of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, Dori Gold, professor of law at Northwestern University, who writes a great deal about the legality of the Jewish presence in all of British-mandated Palestine, Eugene Konderovich, and the policy director of the Israel Policy Forum, Michael Koplow. Also testifying before the committee is one of Israel's most outspoken defenders, Morton Klein, national president of the ZOA, the Zionist Organization of America. And I'm so pleased to have Morton Klein with us on our JBS phones now. Mort, thank you again for joining us here on JBS.
It's great to be with you, Rabbi, and I'm always appreciative of the hard work you do bringing important information and news to mostly the Jewish public, I understand.
Thank you very much, Mort. Okay, first of all, Mort, from your perspective, why did the House Committee on National Security hold these hearings? What's to consider? Congress passed the Jerusalem Embassy Act in 1995, mandating the U.S. Embassy to be moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, or the State Department doesn't get funded. What's left for Congress to do if it's up to the president to decide whether he will or will not sign a waiver to delay that move? How is a congressional hearing on this matter nothing more than a sop to Jews who care about moving the embassy, but in actuality, it's all a show without substance?
No, the chairman of this committee, Congressman Ron DeSantis, who I might add is one of Israel's greatest supporters in all of Congress, truly is. He's running for governor of Florida, actually, this coming year in 2018. One of these hearings, out of frustration that for 22 years, every president has inappropriately used the waiver authority to not move the embassy. And he wanted these hearings to send a message to pressure the administration. It's high time to move it December. Don't invoke this December 1st, especially with respect to the fact that this is the 50-year anniversary of the reunification of Jerusalem. So this is simply an attempt to pressure the administration that Congress is aware of it. They're not ignoring it. They're not feeling you should do whatever you want. DeSantis in this committee wants him to move the embassy. That was the reason for the hearings. And in fact, this has gotten huge publicity everywhere. We're now speaking about it. People have really stopped speaking about it. I can tell you, every 6 months, the only organization publicly complaining and criticizing the administration for 22 years for not moving it is ZOA. The other Jewish organizations have been essentially silent on this issue. So we're hoping to get a dialogue going, and hoping he won't inappropriately invoke the waiver again December 1st. And by the way, I might add, the waiver authority, which was reluctantly included, Majority Leader Bob Dole at the time, Senate Majority Leader, said this, quote, "The president can't lawfully invoke this waiver because he thinks it's better to move it at a later date. The president may not instantly put off the establishment of the American Embassy in Jerusalem. If a waiver is repeatedly and routinely exercised by a president, I expect Congress to remove the waiver authority as soon as that is clear." I talked to Senator Dole and Senator John Kyle of Arizona 22 years ago at the time. They told me that the president should never use it more than once or twice, if at all, and if he does, we're going to get rid of the waiver authority. And it's written saying it has to be an extraordinary security emergency to use it, not just because he thinks it's not a good time. So this has been wrongly used, and no Jewish organization, sad to say, has complained about the fact that this waiver authority is being wrongly used for 22 years.
Very interesting. Now, Mort, it didn't seem to me that was the focus of the committee in hearings. In other words, it would have been interesting to see if the committee began with this question: should the waiver provision be removed from the Jerusalem Embassy Act? As far as I could tell, and you correct me if I'm wrong, this was not the focus of the hearings.
This was not the focus. I'm the only one who raised the issue in my testimony. No one else really knew about this until I did, because ZOA, frankly, was the organization who went to John Kyle and Robert Dole to establish this law. The Washington Post even wrote that AIPAC only entered fighting for the law only after ZOA began it, because they were afraid they wouldn't get credit for this important bill. It was not, but every member of Congress who came to the hearing agree the embassy should be moved. The Republicans agree it should be moved immediately. It's high time. The Democrats simply say, let's wait a little longer. So nobody disagrees that it should be moved. And the discussion was, the theme was, is there a negative to moving it now after 22 long years? And I argued, first of all, it's the Muslims threatening violence if they move it. And I said, we haven't moved the embassy for 22 years. We've had extraordinary violence. We're further from peace now than we were 22 years ago. Not moving the embassy didn't help. And I also argued, and others agreed with me, Konderovich and John Bolton, that this will strengthen American security by making it clear America will not be intimidated into appeasing radical Islamic threats. If we in America allow U.S. policy to be dictated by terrorist threats, we're only encouraging more such threats and terror, and we're undermining the U.S. campaign to eradicate radical Islamic terrorism. Mm-hmm. So, and the people in the panel addressed that and agreed with it.
Okay. Look, this is a House Subcommittee on U.S. national security, which suggests that the U.S. government, Congress, and the White House see moving the embassy to Jerusalem as a possible threat to U.S. national security. Was that articulated? You began to explain what your argument is, and I want to get to that more in a moment. But are there those in the government who are arguing that if we move the embassy from Tel Aviv to
No, the discussion really was, will it cause violence in Israel itself? That really is what the argument was.
But that's not that. Why is that the subject of a House committee hearing? That could be something Israel would debate. Israel could say to.
Well, that's why the waiver provision is wrongly used under these circumstances. It should never. With the waiver, it's said only for an emergency, unconventional, unusual security emergency. It shouldn't be used. But I was not the determinator of what should be discussed at this hearing.
Okay, fair enough. By the way, Mort, were there other organizations, American Jewish organizations, like ZOA, testifying before this House Subcommittee?
No, I was, look, as far as I was the only head of a American Jewish organization who was testifying. There was a marginal left-wing organization that was testifying, and even he said it should be moved, but not now.
I see. Were you invited, or did you volunteer to go?
No. Everybody would like to testify at any of these hearings, any organization. No, I was invited to testify, and of course I readily accepted.
Okay, so the fact that you're not telling me AJC was there, or the President's Conference was there, or ADL was there, the fact that they were not there says nothing one way or the other about their position.
Not at all, no. Any Jewish organization would be invited to testify before a congressional hearing, almost surely would accept.
Okay. I want to try to articulate what I hear Jews arguing when they argue for the delay. And you've already touched on this, but I want to spell it out, and then I want your comment. Many Jews who would love to see the U.S. Embassy move to Jerusalem still agree that doing so now might be nothing more than a counterproductive move. It's not necessary. That the U.S. does have its consulate building in Jerusalem. If the embassy were ever to be moved, it would simply mean changing the nameplate on the front of the building. In other words, there are those who argue this is all a symbolic issue, that in day-to-day real life, the U.S. knows Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, the U.S. is present in the capital of Israel, and that the symbolic gain is not worth the diplomatic upheaval it would cause in the Muslim-Palestinian world, because it would seem as if the United States was giving its hechsher, its approval, of a formal change in status of Jerusalem, which has always been viewed as a matter to be ultimately determined in final stage negotiations, direct negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. How do you respond to those in the Jewish community who agree with you in principle, but who argue for the delay because they believe there is a higher good to be achieved here by continuing to postpone the move rather than shoving it in the Palestinians' face?
Look, this is absurd. The Palestinian Arabs have refused to negotiate for 8 years. They won't even sit down at the table. We're further from peace now than we were 22 years ago when we passed this law, even though the embassy wasn't moved for 22 years. So did it help getting closer to peace? Not at all. I tell these people, peace is impossible. It has nothing to do with the embassy. It's impossible because the Arabs won't accept Israel within any border. They won't negotiate. They won't outlaw terrorist groups. They won't end the promotion of hatred and murder in their speeches, schools, and media. And they continue, Nazi-like, paying Arabs to murder Jews. They pay Arabs to murder Jews at a pension much higher than the average salary of any Palestinian. And only a few weeks ago, they've reconciled with the terrorist group Hamas, who calls for the destruction of Israel and the murder of every Jew. And all this has happened even though the embassy hasn't been moved. So the embassy has nothing to do with it. And it's high time America simply says, the jig is up. Jerusalem will not be divided. The embassy, Jerusalem will remain in Israeli hands, which it will. And this is off the table. It would send a message to the Palestinian Arabs that they're not going to get anything by murder, violence, and refusing to negotiate. And by the way, not only did the Republican Party platform say, quote, we recognize Jerusalem as the eternal, indivisible capital of the Jewish state and call for the American embassy to move there in fulfillment of U.S. law, the 2016 left-wing Democratic Party platform said Jerusalem should remain the capital of Israel, an undivided city. Chuck Schumer, a few weeks ago, the head of the Democratic Party, said he strongly believes Jerusalem is the undivided capital of Israel. I'm calling for the U.S. Embassy in Israel to be relocated to Jerusalem as soon as possible. And by 4-1, Americans support moving the embassy. 4-1. So after 22 years, it's getting rather silly to act as if there's something beneficial, that this is going to make them do something. You know, I have a friend of mine who's actually been engaged for 23 years. Engaged. He's not marrying her. They're going to keep dating. So to say you're engaged for 23 years, you're not engaged. You're just continuing to date. To say that for 22 years you're going to move the embassy after it's now 22 years, you know, by saying, well, let's wait, it means we'll never move it. It's high time to send a message that we will not allow terrorist threats to interfere doing what's moral and what's just, and it helps actually any possibility of peace by sending a message. The jig is up. We're not going to tolerate your nonsense anymore.
Okay. First of all, I love your passion, and I love your sense of humor. I want to push you one more moment. And by the way, the audience should understand, I'm not expressing here my opinion one way or the other. If I am expressing my opinion, I am frustrated that the embassy has not been moved. I think it's a mistake that the embassy has not been moved. I thought it would be moved by Barack Obama. I thought it would be moved already by Donald Trump. But Mort, the fact that it isn't makes me wonder. In other words, there's an old saying, you know, if everybody tells you you're drunk, at least sit down. It sounds to me like, although you and I would love to see the embassy moved, there are those who still see something in this that troubles them. Is it that they believe that there will be a wave of violence that will not only be aimed at Israelis, Mort, but that American officials are afraid that if the United States moves the embassy, it'll be U.S. embassies and consulates all over the world in Muslim territories, attacked by Muslims in reprisal? Is that what's meant by American national security? And that so that even though Republicans overwhelmingly want to see the Capitol moved, Chuck Schumer, head of the Democrats in the Senate, argue the embassy should be moved. It's still not moved. This is not because Donald Trump, in the privacy of his own room, decides he doesn't want to move it. It's not because George Bush decided privately he didn't want to move it, or even Barack Obama decided privately he didn't want to move it. There must be those in every administration. The professionals, administration after administration, must be sending a message to the White House. Understand there's something at risk here greater than the gain of doing something in support of, obviously our closest ally in the Middle East. So I'm asking you one more time, why do you really think it? What's really behind this? Do you believe that administration after administration does not move that embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, even though it is clearly the capital of Israel, and if the embassy were to be moved to West Jerusalem, the issue of the ultimate disposition of Israel, of Jerusalem, could still be on the table? What's the real reason, Mort, we don't have an embassy in Jerusalem?
Well, again, the waiver provision is for unusual, serious security emergency.
Right. So it should not be used. It shouldn't be used. Why is it being used?
It's being used because, I believe, because there's a fear there'll be an outbreak of terrible violence. in the Middle East.
Against whom?
Against the Jews of Israel.
No, I think they're worried about attacks on U.S. embassies in Muslim countries.
Even if that's the case, by allowing threats of radical Islamic terrorism to dictate how we act, that will only strengthen terrorist threats and terrorism itself.
Of
If
course.
we want to end terrorism, we cannot let threats of terrorism and terrorism itself gain benefits. The only way to stop it is when they see whatever they do or threaten, they're not going to get anything. Appeasement always fails. Winston Churchill has a famous line: "Those who appease the crocodile will simply be eaten last."
Yes.
And I'll tell you something else that no one ever says. No Jewish leader, no Israeli leader, that I said yesterday in testimony. The fundamental reason the Arabs say the embassy should not be moved to Jerusalem, the American embassy, is because Jerusalem is holy to us too. This is also our third holiest city. I love this. What do they get? Their top three? What are the top three holy Christian and Jewish cities? I mean, no one even knows. Most people don't even know. Jerusalem, listen to this, is not holy to Muslims. The word Jerusalem is never mentioned in the Quran, not a single time. A famous city, never mentioned. In the Jewish holy book, 700 times. From 1948, Rabbi, till 67, when the Arab Muslim country of Jordan controlled eastern Jerusalem, they had it. That's the real Jerusalem. There was no water, electricity, or plumbing in Jerusalem. It was a slum. Jordan built its royal residence and universities and its capital in Amman, not in Jerusalem. Jordan broadcast the Friday prayers from their major mosque in Amman, not Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem. The majority of people living in Jerusalem since the mid-1800s have been Jews. Jews face Jerusalem when they pray. Muslims face Mecca. And finally, listen to this. Abbasini and Muslims claim that when Muhammad had a dream, he went from Jerusalem to heaven, that's in the Quran. It doesn't say Jerusalem. Muhammad had a dream. It wasn't a real occurrence. What it says is that he went on his winged horse from the sacred mosque to the furthest mosque. The sacred mosque was in Mecca. The furthest mosque, we don't really know. But evidence doesn't support the claim that the furthest mosque is in Jerusalem. Why not? Because when Palestine is mentioned in the Quran, it's referred to as the closest land. If Palestine is the closest land, how can Jerusalem have the furthest mosque? So it cannot be. And listen to this. Palestine then, when the Quran was written, hadn't been conquered by the Muslims. They didn't even have it. And there wasn't a single mosque in Palestine. How's that? So it could not have been from a mosque in Jerusalem because there were no mosques in Jerusalem. So this is an incredible propaganda lie that the world is allowing the Muslims to perpetrate that has no basis in fact or meaning. And when I've said this in speeches at synagogues, they say, Mort, you have no right to tell Muslims what's holy to them. It's their decision. I said, not if they don't have evidence. I said, suppose they say New York City is holy to them. Do we have to give half of New York City to them, even though there's no basis? They say Washington is holy to them. They can't simply say it. There has to be a basis for it. So it's not even holy to them. This is a fraudulent argument that the Arabs are perpetrating, and it's high time the world says, no more. We're not going to allow this nonsense to continue and to determine our policy.
Again, I think you say it very, very well. It's not the way, however, the issue is being framed in diplomatic circles. In diplomatic circles, it's being framed, whether the Muslims have a claim or not, the status of Jerusalem is to be determined in direct negotiations between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, and that it's not about their delusion, and they are delusional. It's about the fact that the United States does not want to preempt a negotiation which the United States supports, namely direct negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis. And therefore, the fear, the diplomatic fear, is always over, will a U.S. move of the embassy undermine negotiations about the final status of Jerusalem? You and I see this exactly the same way. But the American administration is committed still to an Oslo framework in which the Palestinians and Israelis will one day sit down and work out a peace agreement, and in that peace agreement, the status of Jerusalem will also be resolved. Until then, there are those in the State Department saying to the White House, you can't undermine that, and therefore you can't move the embassy, and therefore you must exercise the waiver. And what you've told me sadly is the congressional hearing that you appeared before did not bring this issue up, and you and I understand if they were serious, this would be the subject of the hearings, not an interesting point made by Morton Klein on JBS.
It's becoming ludicrous to talk about that there's a peace process when Oslo was signed 24 years ago, and the Arabs promote hatred and violence, pay people to kill Jews, don't accept Israel as a Jewish state, won't even negotiate for 8 long years. They haven't come to the table in 8 years. I think one time in 8 years they came to the table. So as long as they refuse to come to the table, then they get their way and the embassy's not moved. I mean, they control it by simply not negotiating. It's absurd. And it makes them believe that they can get everything ultimately without them doing anything to show they have an interest in living in peace with the Jewish state of Israel.
More, I only have a few seconds left. As you left the hearings, did you have any sense of optimism that these hearings might change the current administration policy? And could it be that in December, Donald Trump will not sign the waiver and that the embassy would be moved? On a scale of 1 to 10, what do you think the prospects are for the U.S. moving the embassy in 2017?
Because President Trump thinks he has a chance at getting a peace deal, and I think there's virtually no chance, he may invoke the waiver one more time. But I think these hearings and the articles about it have changed the possibility to 50-50 that maybe he will not invoke it. There's a real chance he won't invoke it December 1st. But I think there's a powerful chance that 6 months after December 1st, it'll be over. He's going to move the embassy. Every single member of that committee wants the embassy moved. Everyone.
It's a wonderful analysis. Mort, you do fabulous work. And, everybody knows you're one of the controversial figures on the world Jewish scene. I don't get it. I think you have a perspective that is clear, it is consistent, and it reflects really what so many in the Jewish community who are committed to Israel feel and believe. I think you're doing outstanding work. Kol tuv v'hatzlacha. You continue your work, and I want you to make yourself available to JBS as often as possible, and I will see you very soon.
Our dinner Sunday night with Ambassador Friedman, Tom Cotton, Christopher Ruddy, Steve Bannon, and others. And to learn more about the things we say and do, ZOA.org, ZOA.org. You'll learn more about our discussion we just had today. Thank you for asking powerful, insightful questions to allow me to say whatever I can say about these issues.
Thank you so much, Mort. That's Morton Klein, National President of ZOA, the Zionist Organization of America. My thanks, as always, to our production coordinator, Serge Goldberg, who's doubling today as director for this edition of The News, In the News. JBS's Associate Director, Dara Golub, editors John McDevitt and Cordelia Siporin, and to the producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.